Hello and welcome, everyone. This is the Happy Warrior podcast and YouTube channel. I'm your host, Happy Warrior Pete, and today I have the privilege of having journalist and author Mathew Lysiak to talk with us about a little-known figure that created a website that has more influenced the current landscape of U.S. journalism and U.S. politics than maybe any other. I'm talking about Mathew Lysiak's new book, the Drudge Revolution, the untold story of how talk radio, Fox News, gift shop Clerk with an internet connection took down the mainstream media. Thank you for being on with us, Mathew, and welcome.
Thank you for having me, Peter. I appreciate it.
So let's get into the question that everyone always likes to start with. What is your book about?
Matt Drudge. As you mentioned, I would say there isn't a single individual in our generation who's had more of an influence on the way we consume information than Matt Drudge. And we know absolutely nothing about this guy. So, what I wanted to do with this book was set about not only trying to pull back the curtain on who Matt Drudge is, but tell this broader story about this populist revolution in news and information that I would argue led directly to the election of Donald Trump.
All right. Yeah, I enjoyed your book a lot. What I found so fascinating, and this is a mulligan, folks. I actually recorded this last week, but I messed with the audio, and Matthew was kind enough to do it again. I found so fascinating is I really didn't know anything about Matt Drudge's life. Your book kind of lays out who Matt Drudge was. I had no idea, for example, that Matt Drudge had a terrible family life growing up. I didn't know that Matt Drudge was gay. It was a really fascinating read, and I think for multiple reasons people should check out your book. Why is it that we know so little about Matt Drudge's life until your book? Why is
Like
that?
everything on the Drudge Report, it's because it's exactly the way Matt wanted it and intended it. He is reclusive by nature, and you mentioned a difficult family life. My book doesn't delve into pop psychology in the least. I'm not qualified to write about that, but I do think it's relevant to point out that Matt did come from a highly dysfunctional family, a young child, an only child, middle class family. His father essentially disowned him and his mother had severe mental health issues. And in this, only in America story can this young man who also had virtually no education, he finished 355th out of 361 in his high school graduating class, no college. Only in America could a young man like this rise up and completely usurp the entire media landscape. But as far as who Matt Drudge is and why he's been so guarded about that, he made a decision back in 2007 that he thought the website would be more powerful without his name attached to it. And he decided to go dark. And since then, he's done only a very small handful of interviews, I think three. His picture's been taken once in the past 12 years. And he's effectively just gone dark.
Wow, I mean, he's even a more of a recluse than I am, and that is saying something. So let's talk a little bit about to get our viewers who aren't super familiar with a little bit of journalism history here. What was the world of journalism pre Matt Drudge? So we're talking about the early to mid 1990s. What was journalism like? And I want to go into how you feel that Matt Drudge changed it.
Yeah, I mean, not sure the demographic of your audience. I'm 42, and when I was a kid in the early 90s, we had ABC, NBC, CBS, and a handful of newspapers. And the editors and producers of these major shows and publications effectively served as gatekeepers of information. They decided what we heard, when we heard it. For instance, they had information about JFK and his affairs. They decided we didn't need to know about that. They also had some things on Reagan that they evaluated and decided we didn't know. But that all ended. And rarely can you look at history and see these definitive moments when everything changed. But this is a case where I think you can make the argument that it did. And it begins with the President Clinton having an affair and potential obstruction of justice investigation that was being done by Michael Isikoff, who did really great work on this. But there's a small group of right leaning individuals, Lucianne Goldberg, Linda Tripp, Ann Coulter, Kellyanne Conway,
Yeah, a lot of
George
names we know
Conway.
now.
Yeah, right. George Conway. And they were all they were convinced that the media was going to hide this story and that Isikoff was taking too long for them. So, on the suggestion by Ann Coulter, Lucy Ann Goldberg called up this little known blogger. He had a bit of a following, but not a big one, named Matt Drudge, and gave him what I would argue is the biggest story of our generation, the biggest news scoop, the story of the potential obstruction of justice and affair that President Clinton had. And it went all the way down to the president of the United States, according to the Star Report, looking at the internet and watching the Drudge Report at 2 o'clock in the morning that day and seeing that his entire White House was going to be on fire for the next several months or however long his administration lasted. But that was a real pivot point in history because you can't hold stories anymore. There is no
Yeah.
holding a story. There are no gatekeepers. Well, for decades there weren't gatekeepers. I think you can make an argument now that we're coming back full circle in a sense where while post Matt Drudge there was the populist wave in media and news went uninhibited. Now you can see these gatekeepers sort of creeping back in through the form of corporations like Google and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. But I think that's still to be determined. I mean, we're still kind of in the midst of that.
Yeah, I think that's a very good insight. I think you're completely right that the gatekeeping role. I think a lot of people, especially in the establishment left in the U.S. and the Western world, kind of misses those days in some ways because it used to be that the editor, if you were an editor, that was a position not just that you had control what your publication was doing, but what stories, like you said, would go out there. And that's kind of been lost. And now we're kind of at the news orgs themselves have been kind of hollowed out by what they can do. They usually pick their articles based on what they think will get clicks and kind of what's trending on social media more often than not. That's not true for
Yeah,
every.
I agree with that 100%.
Yeah. So Matt Drudge changed a lot there. Uh, Moving away from journalism, which definitely got changed by Matt Drudge. How did Matt Drudge change U.S. politics?
Every single major political campaign beginning in the late 90s had somebody on board known as a Drudge Whisperer. This was a staffer on the campaign who their main job was to either influence Matt if possible, or at least kind of have some sort of in with Matt Drudge, which is very difficult because he was extremely hard to reach. And, it got to the extent that campaigns would sometimes fly people out to try to meet with Matt. So his influence, and I would say it peaked in 2015, 2016, when the GOP primary had a whole bunch of very conservative candidates. And they also had who at the time was perceived as a liberal from New York who was pro choice, named Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And Matt Drudge went all in on Donald Trump. And I think that what he did was he gave permission to conservatives to vote for Matt for vote for Donald Trump. And don't take my word for it. Talk to Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz has been on the record many times saying that the reason he believes he lost a fundamental shift in that election in the primary campaign leading up to the general was the coverage by Matt Drudge. He would talk about how after he won Colorado, if you went on the Drudge Report, you'd be convinced he lost it by the way it
Yeah.
was the narrative that was pushed. So his influence, I don't think, is as great as it was in 2015 and 2016. And Matt's making a really big bet right now because he's weaponized his site on behalf of Joe Biden and Joe Biden's campaign. And I think that this is sort of a last gasp because social media has taken a big chunk out of him in the past few years. And if Matt loses this gamble, and if Donald Trump does win re-election, I think Matt's days as a political kingmaker are effectively over. But his influence up until now has been it can't be it can't I really don't think it can be overstated. I mean, I think it was him who pushed and was the main factor in Donald Trump becoming the general election candidate.
Yeah, your book is so fascinating because it's not. I thought that this was an issue mostly of the right, but you have a great story in there in the '08 fight between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, and they would take stories. The Hillary Clinton campaign would take stories that they thought, this if we put this out there, this will make us look bad. We have to be above the fray, but we can hand it over to Drudge, and they can put it out there for us. And your book makes a good case that we wouldn't have gotten Barack Obama if it hadn't been for the Drudge Report. Is that about right?
Andrew Breitbart believed that, and Andrew Breitbart, who, unlike Matt Drudge, was a real true believer in the cause of populist conservatism in his form of it, was pulling his hair out trying to figure out why every time he would put up a story negative about Obama, like a Reverend Wright story, Matt, from whatever remote location he was at, would go online and pull it down. And Andrew Breitbart worked as Matt's AM editor, so your audience knows. So his job in the morning was to set up the Drudge Report. And finally, Andrew reached out to Matt and said, "Look, what's happening here? Why does it seem like you're pushing for Obama?" And Matt's response was very telling. He said, "An Obama presidency might be shitty for the country, but it sure would be great for the website." And it's hard to argue with the results there, because at least financially for Matt, I can't think of more than a handful of people who did better financially under Barack Obama than Matt Drudge did. His net worth is estimated at north of $100 million. So that brings up another issue that I get asked a lot about, is like, what is this shift to the left? And Matt was never a right-wing guy that people think he was. Matt Drudge was always a businessman, and a damn good one at that. And he successfully navigated his website to not only stay relevant, but to stay incredibly lucrative. And, once again, with the shift to the left, you see everybody's talking about Matt Drudge again. He was trending on Twitter #1 a few days ago. The president of the United States is tweeting about him. So I think there's a bit of genius on how he plays both sides. And right now, that's exactly what he's doing.
Yeah, I find it very interesting that Trump, last week, if you guys don't know, he started attacking the Drudge Report because Drudge was running this article about maybe these mini strokes. And I found it fascinating. Well, one thing is the president was saying that Drudge didn't like him in 2016, and maybe like on a political level, like a personal level, maybe he didn't, but I doubt. I mean, there's a good chance that we would not have gotten Donald Trump, as you said, as the nominee for the GOP, and then that, of course, got him the win in November. Because I was a big Cruz support back in the day. I remember winning. They won Iowa, and it's like the night of the next day, people are acting like it hadn't even happened, and that it just drove me just crazy at the time. But you put in the book that Matt Drudge's #1 priority has always been about the Drudge Report and taking good care of it and making sure it stays at the tippy top of influence. So it's a fascinating part of the book. So let's move on to this. I got some of these questions down here. How has Matt Drudge, we talked a little bit about this, how has Matt Drudge and his website created the conservative media ecosphere? What's its influence on it, do you think?
Well, to go back to history a little bit, to the time when Matt became relevant, at the time, Matt saw and so did Andrew Breitbart, and Rush Limbaugh to a large extent saw this earlier, that they perceived the media as, according to Gallup, 90% Democrat. Yet the population of America was overwhelmingly conservative. So they saw a need of a void to be filled. And Matt successfully filled that by being an outlet for conservative causes to get their side out. And I mean, I think the Clinton story is a perfect example of that. There was a group of influential right-wing people who had information about the president, and nobody would take it. So they went to Matt Drudge, and 2 hours later, after fighting for weeks to get this story somewhere, it was online for the whole world to see. So by becoming the first person to do that, he attained a lot of power because politicians, especially on the right, used him to try to, in their eyes, level the playing field. And it began this, it spawned all these different websites. And essentially, by taking away the gatekeepers, it created a platform where everybody has all the information all the time. And I'm personally, and I don't try not to put too many of my personal opinions in the book, but I'm a big believer that more information is better for
I
everybody.
agree.
And that, good information is the cure to bad information, but censorship as a journalist is intolerable, and it's not good. So I love the fact that we don't, that we have the situation, but it does lead to problems too, right? Like
Yeah.
there's clear pitfalls to having all this information. But I'm an optimist, and I think that we're moving into a golden age of journalism. There's never been a time where people have craved information more, and we all have essentially newspapers in the palm of our hand everywhere we go. I find it really fascinating. But in terms of Matt's influence on the ecosystem of conservatism, he was known for the longest time as the right wing's editor, where they'd wake up in the morning and Matt would talk about this. And one of the people I had cooperate with this book was Joseph Curl, who was Matt's only full-time employee. And Curl said that Matt told him when he took over the Drudge Report, Curl was the AM editor, we don't, at the Drudge Report, we don't ride the waves, we create them. So what we're going to do is we're going to post a story in the morning. Rush Limbaugh is going to put it on his A block at noon. Then the White House press secretary is going to get harassed about it at 2:30 Eastern time. By then, the conservative ecosphere and the rest of the media is going to turn it into 500 additional stories. But by that point, we're on to what's next. We're going to craft the narrative. So what's important to understand about Matt's skill and his genius was not just that he had a great ability to see a story, which he did, or have this unique ability to see what was that a lead in paragraph 8 of an AP story should have been a true lead when it was buried down low, which is also true. But it was his ability to craft an entire narrative through a cornucopia of different stories on his website. And you and I, you and I have talked about how Matt, if you go on his website, there's themes that have been persistent for 20 years. And one of them is that will persist until the end of the Drudge Report is chaos. That is a hallmark of the Drudge Report. Like every time you go on, at least once a week, there'll be story about locusts, plagues, famine. And if you don't span outside of the Drudge Report, you might be convinced that we're really in the middle of an apocalypse. And the message that he's conveying right now through all of the sex robots and weather stories and plagues and locusts is that right now Joe Biden is the calm hand. He can steer us through this. And Trump's a loose cannon. And that's the narrative he's pushing. Whether it's going to be successful is going to be a real true reveal of his power.
It's a real gamble he's making, but I understand the logic you're leaving there. The ability to create waves, that is a unique and very special talent that a lot of conservative media, even libertarian media, is missing. Often, libertarian conservative media is kind of like the moon to the mainstream media's sun, and we our story of the day is a reflection of whatever they choose to make their story of the day. And Drudge, what a talent that I really think he has that's really special is that he's like, I get away from all that. I create the narrative that everyone's going to be bouncing off of. I don't try to just do whatever the mainstream media says is the news of the day, which that's a rare gift. I think a conservative media, in particular, would do a lot better. I think if they would find a way to gain that talent for themselves. But it's a hard one to take care of, as the Matt Drudge is finding out right now.
And on that note, Peter, like one thing I think your audience might find interesting is that this isn't unique to Matt starting the Drudge Report. Matt going back and interviewing over 218 people, going back to his high school days. Matt was like that as a child. He created the Drudge Report without anybody's help, just himself, like his will. He pushed it from the very beginning when he objectively had no chance. He looked like a statistical anomaly by the sociologists. They should study Matt Drudge, and because it's really a case of this one man who just against all odds had this force of will and always had a confidence about himself from the days where his teenagers would try to talk to him. And I mean his teachers, and I spoke to teachers of his in high school, and they'd be like, here's this kid standing in front of me, he's failing, like we know he's having family issues. completely confident, not fake confident, never doubted himself, always so certain that he was going to be just fine, and acted as if, he knew something they didn't about himself, and that persisted. So when we kind of talk about Matt's paranoia, which is evident in the book a bit too, and why he chooses to shut people out a lot and his independence, I think it's part of his character.
Yeah, you sometimes with those kind of issues, you get the good with the bad. Because sometimes people have some of the hardest stuff going on in their personal lives, whether it's mental, emotional stuff. They're also like super confident or really able to perform. I think Matt Drudge, and we're not. I don't want to go into pop psychology because I do hate that when people
Yeah,
make all
yeah, me
these
too.
allegations of people they've never met. But um, I did. There are many times there I honestly feel really bad for Matt Drudge, especially when it came to his dad, because I also had a hard background as a kid. That is one tough road to hoe.
They have
So
reconciled, though. I'm happy to say, and they
yeah,
they
yeah, no,
they
that's a
talk now.
yeah, and his dad is the one that teaches him to use a computer, which is really
So
important. So he could do
yeah, his
everything they
dad
did.
was actually a computer, um, a revolutionary in his own way. He started RefDesk. You know what that is?
I
RefDesk.com.
do not. I'm
It was
I
like a really early and extremely popular ability to look up information on the internet, and one of the first to do it. And it was totally revolutionary. New York Times wrote a big article on it right when Matt Drudge started about Bob Drudge. And he sold RefDesk, but for the longest time Matt wouldn't link to his dad's website, which was the ultimate payback in many ways. And it's interesting. He does now, though. The Drudge Report does link to it.
Okay, I'll have to look at that long list of links that the Drudge Report leaves at the bottom. I'll have to check that out. So, where do you think the future of let's talk about this. Where do you think the future of conservative media is, including Drudge? And then what do you think is going to happen when Drudge goes away? Because Matt Drudge makes it clear at several points in the book. He says the Drudge site is done when I'm done. And I mean, maybe. And you talked about this also, how Twitter is changing things, Silicon Valley. So what do you think the future is for conservative media?
Conservative media is going to be fine. There's some great sites now that are doing great aggregating work. I know Bongino Report's popular. Citizen Free Press is a good one that this seems to be doing really well in terms of numbers. But back in 2015, 2016, the Drudge Report was doing between 30 and 35 million views a month. Okay,
That's a
3.7
lot.
million uniques. It's a ton. Now it's down to about half that on both ends, between around 20 million views a month and around 1.7, 1.8 million uniques. So the trajectory is going downward. And I think it's interesting and almost, fitting that for the longest time, and you probably remember this, Peter, people would talk about, oh, this is the next Drudge Report. This is going to replace the Drudge Report. Here's this new
Yes.
website. None of them ever were the new Drudge Report. But Matt is increasingly being replaced by a revolution of its own, the social media revolution. It's not going to be a person. It's going to be a revolution. And that's the thing. Matt Drudge's appeal to editors when I was at the New York Daily News for many years wasn't, there's no personal affinity to Matt Drudge. They would go on his website over and over again because Matt Drudge was always first at everything, always. And there was a feeling that if you went on the Drudge Report, you could miss something. Well, he's first anymore, and it's not even close. Twitter is by far ahead of Matt in terms of being first. So now you're left with some loyalists who click on the Drudge Report just out of interest or habit, and that's been fading. Um, so I think what you're seeing with the Drudge Report is currently is Matt. Matt knows that he knows the numbers as well as I do. And I think it's an attempt to stay relevant and maybe try to pick up a new audience on the left a little bit, which he has gotten some. It looks like he has replaced some of the conservative viewers or audience with people on the left. In terms of the conservative movement with media, I think it's going to be fine. I mean, we have so much access to information. And remember, everything's cyclical, Peter. Like in the early 1900s, some cities had 20 newspapers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And and then slowly the corporate glaze came over by 1950s and 1960s. Slowly we began seeing corporations take over all the newspapers, and then the gatekeepers come back. Drudge represented a change in that. And gatekeepers gone, populist wave in news. Once again, we're seeing the gatekeepers creep out through social media, but I don't think it'll attach. I think that the freedom in media, people are too diverse and too educated right now. We won't tolerate it. I mean, I won't tolerate my news being censored. I'll go somewhere else. I try very hard to. I try not to rely on Twitter too much because it's also, if you look at Twitter trending, that's also trying to control a narrative, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
they're all gatekeepers there, Facebook, and it's okay. They're private corporations. They're allowed to. But I believe that the free market will dictate that constantly. Libertarian, conservative ideas will keep popping up, and same with liberal and socialist ideas. And we're just going to be surrounded with a ton of ideas. And my hope is just that it's always an honest fight over ideas, and that the best ideas eventually win, which in my optimistic view is the course of human history. But that's to be determined, right? We'll have to see.
I hope you're right. I like your optimism, but I do hope that's the future. People are very educated, and we'll have to see if the attempt to recontrol the narrative works or not. Were there any things when you were working on the book that you wish you could have got more into, or topics that you couldn't really get into or talk about?
Look, I'm really proud of this book. But in full disclosure, there were a few years of Matt's life that I just couldn't pin down. I felt like I had a good idea, but it's like I'm kind of an old school journalist. I don't like anonymous sources. I feel like if people are going to go on if it's true, people are going to go on the record about it. I get jealous of like these Michael Wolff types who can write a
Mm-hmm.
book and just create all these sources and fill in narratives. So there were periods of time where I wish I could have gotten more, especially with I wanted to go more into Matt's current state of mind. I'm now obviously I had to publish this book. He handed it to the publishers like a year early. They had to edit
Mm-hmm.
it before it comes out. But there was a period after Drudge got tight with Jared Kushner, and it was right before Matt went on the Alex Jones show and gave what I consider this remarkable interview. It's extremely interesting, and if your audience hasn't heard it yet, it is available on YouTube. Alex Jones interview where Matt Drudge just shows up. But I wanted more of that period, and I had some really interesting stuff I couldn't be 100% on,
Mm-hmm.
so I had to leave it on the floor.
Oh, that's too bad. I think that interview with Alex Jones is particularly good. So, what is next for you? Where can people find you and your work?
I do a palate cleanser. I've been immersed in Drudge world for 3 years of my life right now, and I think my wife's sick of hearing about it. My kids are really tired of hearing about it. So every year I do a Halloween play that I have produced called Heidi's Monkeys, and I just finished the script a few weeks ago, and it's going to be produced in Sonoyta, Arizona, at the Meadery, October 29th, 30th, and 31st.
That's awesome. That is really cool.
Thank you.
I can't think of the writer, but it was one of the classic 19th century writers, and that was their tradition that they would write. I think they did theirs at Christmas, but they would write some kind of scary tale once a year. And that's something I'd like to be able to do. That's just a good thing.
Peter, you should just do it. You should just do it. Jump
Yeah.
in.
You'll definitely put it on Twitter when that happens if it gets recorded. Well, thank you so much, Mathew Lysiak, for talking. I enjoyed the book a lot. You guys should all check it out. You can find it on Amazon, on Audible, and wherever else good books are sold. You can find Mathew Lysiak on Twitter. He is at Mathew Lysiak. You can see that right there on the screen. It's been fun. I appreciate you willing to redo the interview. I was kicking myself all over the place for messing up the audio, but this one was just as good, if not better. So thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Peter. Have a great day.
You too. Take care.
The Happy Warrior Podcast. Conservative commentary on the news of the day from a more positive perspective. Hosted by Peter Von Pischke, produced by Robert Malik, a production of the Sioux Empire Podcast Network.
A production of the SiouxEmpire.com.